The Indian Parliament is a creature of Constitution. Therefore, a parliamentary law to be valid must conform in all respects with the Constitution. It is for the courts to decide whether an enactment is constitutional or not, and they have the power to declare a parliamentary enactment void if it is inconsistent with a provision of the Constitution. The courts would refuse to give effect to any unconstitutional law. There are procedures laid down in the Constitution through which the courts may be invited to scrutinize legislation and to ascertain if the constitutional restriction has been transgressed by Parliament in enacting a law. Contrasting the British Parliament with the legislature like Indian Parliament, Dicey calls the former as sovereign and the latter as subordinate or non-sovereign. These terms are misleading as they create a false impression that the Indian Parliament is subordinate to some external authority or that India is not yet an independent country. A much better way to characterize the constitutional position of the Indian Parliament is to say that it is sovereign within its powers. Though its freedom of action is controlled by the Constitution, yet within the sphere and limits allowed to it, its powers are plenary and it may pass laws of any sort. Parliament has been assigned a place of importance in the governmental structure of the country. It is a source of all central legislation because legislative power of the Union has been assigned to it. If the parliamentary legislation does not infringe any constitutional limit, then the function of the courts is only to interpret and apply the law. Courts cannot then go into the policy or wisdom of the legislation. The courts cannot declare a statute unconstitutional simply on the ground that it has unjust or harsh provisions, or because it is supposed to violate natural, social, or political rights of the citizen, unless it can be shown that such injustice is prohibited or such rights are protected by the Constitution. A court does not declare an act void because, in its opinion, it is opposed to the spirit that is supposed to pervade the Constitution, but not so expressed in words. Legislative power is restricted only by the Constitution and not by any promise which the government may have undertaken. Parliament is fully competent to legislate no matter whether it would be contrary to the guarantee given or any obligation undertaken by the government. It is difficult on airy general principle to limit the omnipotence of the sovereign legislative power by judicial imposition, except insofar as the Constitution gives that authority. It will thus be correct to say that within the permissible limits, the Indian Parliament is as omnicompetent as the British Parliament. If no fetter is to be found in the Constitution itself, the Parliament is competent to make a law even if it is contrary to the guarantees given or obligation undertaken by the government. Article 245 Clause 2 explicitly provides that no law made by Parliament is to be invalid on the ground that it is extraterritorial operation, nor is there any restriction on its powers to amend, delete, and obliterate a statute, or to give it a prospective or retrospective effect, or even to levy a tax retrospectively. A tax law not contravening constitutional prohibition, such as Article 14, cannot be declared invalid merely because it imposes double taxation or that it is confiscatory in nature. As such, this power is incidental to the power to levy the tax. If a law is struck down by the courts as being invalid for an infirmity, Parliament can cure the same by placing another law by removing the infirmity in question. However, the courts have developed certain techniques by which they can bypass the question of adjudicating the constitutionality of statutes. A law passed by Parliament can neither be invalidated on the ground of non-application of mind nor on mala fides. Mala fides are ulterior motives attributed to the Parliament in making a law within its competence can never make such law unconstitutional. The Supreme Court has observed the legislature as a body cannot be accused of having passed a law for an extraneous purpose. Even assuming that the executive in a given case has ulterior motive in moving a legislation, that motive cannot render the passing of a law mala fide. This kind of transferred malice is unknown in the field of legislation. While the courts can declare a statute unconstitutional when it transgresses constitutional limits, they do not inquire into the propriety of exercising the legislative power. It is assumed that the legislative discretion has been properly exercised. The courts do not scrutinize the motives of the legislature in passing a statute. The propriety, expediency, and necessity of a legislative act are for the determination of legislative authority concerned and are not for the determination by the courts.